Right. Let's unpack this. From the battlefields of Ukraine to the intricate dance of global trade, it often feels like the world is constantly navigating this really high-stakes chess match.
Hmm.
Today, we're diving into some fascinating new insights that suggest, well, maybe a radically different way forward for these incredibly complex global challenges.
Right.
Our mission really is to explore why current approaches to these major conflicts and, the escalating trade tensions aren't quite hitting the mark.
Yeah, falling short in many ways.
Exactly. And critically, how rising powers like India and China seem uniquely positioned to reshape the path forward, both diplomatically and economically.
Indeed. And what's truly intriguing here, I think, is how seemingly disparate events, a protracted war over here and a tariff dispute over there, are in fact deeply intertwined.
Right. They connect.
Absolutely. We'll be looking at why traditional strategies, the ones we've seen deployed, seem to have reached their limits, and why a more, let's say, multipolar approach, one that truly incorporates key global players like India and China, might be the only viable path to genuine stability.
Okay.
Our deep dive today draws from, well, quite a stack of recent analyses. Expert views on geopolitical mediation, some really detailed game theoretic models looking at trade disputes, and crucially, historical perspectives that help ground today's complex dynamics.
Excellent. So let's start with that persistent Russia-Ukraine conflict. As of mid-2025, we're heading into its fourth year.
Fourth year, yeah.
And still no clear end in sight. The human cost and the global ripple effects are just devastating.
Truly devastating.
We're talking about widespread destruction of Ukraine's infrastructure, massive disruption to global food and energy markets, and a palpable reignition of Cold War-era hostilities that have really fractured those international institutions meant to keep the peace.
And the human toll, specifically, it's staggering. Reports from the UN Humanitarian Report for 2025 indicate over 400,000 Ukrainians have been killed or wounded since the invasion began.
400,000.
It's an enormous number. And the World Bank's 2025 data, it paints an equally grim picture. More than 10 million people displaced from their homes.
10 million?
Yes. And Ukraine's GDP, contracted by a shocking 40% since 2022.
40%? Wow.
It really makes you wonder how any nation can endure that scale of suffering. And yet, despite these tragic figures, the Western strategies, both military and economic, which were primarily designed to pressure Russia into submission.
Right, the goal was clear.
The goal was clear, but they simply haven't achieved their desired political outcomes. This enduring impasse, this stalemate, it makes a new framework absolutely essential, one rooted in genuine diplomacy, maybe neutrality, and a dose of geopolitical realism.
That's a critical point.
Yeah.
When we talk about these, failed strategies, economic pressure, specifically the sanctions, comes to mind immediately, doesn't it?
It does. That was the big lever.
The initial expectation was that these sanctions, particularly targeting Russia's oil and gas exports, would cripple its war machine. But the sources we're looking at reveal a very different story.
They certainly do. According to the International Energy Agency's 2024 report, Russia has managed to redirect over 80% of its crude oil exports.
80%? Where did it go?
Mostly to India, China, and other non-Western nations. This highlights a significant adaptation capacity within the Russian economy that perhaps wasn't fully anticipated. The G7 price cap on Russian oil, you remember that?
Yeah.
Intended to limit their revenue.
Yeah, that was supposed to be the key.
Well, it was largely circumvented. They used what's being called a shadow fleet, basically a network of older tankers operating outside Western financial systems, and they set up ruble-based trade agreements.
Clever, in a way.
Adaptable, certainly. So far from isolating Moscow, this sanctions regime has perhaps inadvertently actually accelerated the development of an alternative financial architecture, particularly across the BRICS plus countries.
So it's reducing dollar and euro dominance.
Exactly. It's actively nudging things in that direction.
So sanctions in this specific instance haven't delivered that knockout blow many hoped for. This reminds me of, other historical cases where sanctions were applied. How does Russia's resilience here compare? What lessons can we draw from those past examples?
That's an excellent question.
Yeah.
Because sanctions have had very mixed results throughout history, haven't they?
Not a silver bullet.
Not at all. For instance, take apartheid South Africa. Sanctions were instrumental there, yes, but they largely complemented really strong domestic resistance and immense global moral pressure. It wasn't just the sanctions alone.
Okay.
Now, contrast that with Iraq during the 1990s. There, Sanctions inflicted catastrophic humanitarian devastation.
Generals suffered.
Terrible suffering. But they never actually toppled Saddam Hussein's regime.
Didn't achieve the political goal.
Exactly. So today, Russia's situation is different again. It has a much larger, more diversified economy than Iraq did. It has substantial sovereign wealth reserves, and these strategic partnerships, especially with giants like India and China, significantly insulate it from a similar collapse. That oil lever, which was once thought to be the decisive pressure point, well, it's simply not proving as effective as anticipated in this particular conflict.
And on the military front, it seems like a similar story of limits, despite just unprecedented levels of Western support for Ukraine.
It is, yeah. Western nations have provided Ukraine with an incredible volume of advanced weaponry. I mean, HIMARS rocket systems, Javelin anti-tank missiles, Turkish Bayraktar drones, Patriot air defense systems.
Top-tier stuff.
Absolutely. And by 2025, even Western fighter jets are arriving. Yet despite all that, the battlefield lines remain stubbornly stagnant.
Like World War I trenches, almost.
It heavily resembles that, yes. Characterized by heavy casualties and minimal territorial gains for either side. It really points to a strategic deadlock. The conventional military aid alone just isn't breaking.
And the risk of escalation, it's always lurking there, isn't it? What are the sources saying about crossing those potential red lines?
That's a critical concern, and it's highlighted repeatedly. The provision of long-range missile systems, while obviously enhancing Ukraine's strike capabilities, carries significant risk.
A risk of
Escalating the conflict into Russian territory. And that crosses red lines Moscow has repeatedly warned against.
We've seen this playbook before.
We have. Look back at the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. You saw how aggressively the U.S. responded to perceived threats near its borders. It signals how major powers rarely tolerate direct threats near their frontiers without triggering, well, drastic response.
History echoes.
History echoes indeed. And even the attempts at a ceasefire-first approach, which was tried for over 6 months, that also failed.
Why did that fail?
Because it deliberately avoids addressing the core political disagreements that are actually driving the war.
Yeah.
You can pause the fighting, but if you don't solve the underlying issues, it's simply not a viable long-term solution.
Which leads us, I suppose, to a crucial point. The inflexibility of the key actors involved. It really seems like everyone is dug in pretty deep. Russia's demands, for instance, they sound quite extreme from the outside.
They are. Russia's insistence on Ukraine's denazification, demilitarization, and permanent neutrality. It reflects a complex mix. Part geopolitical paranoia, maybe, and part what the sources describe as a kind of imperial nostalgia. These demands are effectively seen, certainly by Kyiv and much of the world, as stripping Ukraine of its sovereignty. That's politically unacceptable to Kyiv and, frankly, morally indefensible to many globally.
And where does this rigidity come from?
Well, the analysis suggests it stems from deeply held historical grievances and perceived security imperatives on both sides. Neither side feels it can afford to budge, and that's what leads to this tragic, ongoing human cost.
And on Ukraine's side, their ambition to join NATO, which is actually enshrined in their constitution, the sources describe it as a catalyst for destruction. That's a really strong phrase. What makes it so?
It's a poignant paradox, isn't it? Ukraine's pursuit of NATO membership is understandable. It's rooted in legitimate fears, especially after the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the ongoing Russian aggression since then.
Sure, they want security.
Of course. But the actual security dividend from pursuing NATO membership has been elusive, to say the least. Despite receiving over $100 billion in military and financial support from NATO countries since 2022, Ukraine remains outside the alliance.
Still vulnerable.
Terribly vulnerable to attack. And the sources argue that the price Ukraine has already paid for this ambition, in terms of lives lost, mass displacement, infrastructure destruction, is simply far, far too high for a security guarantee that hasn't actually materialized.
And the U.S. stance. Supporting Ukraine's sovereignty, yes, but perhaps not fully addressing Russia's core fears.
That's a crucial observation made in the analysis. The United States maintains a position of strong support for Ukraine's sovereignty, its right to self-determination. Absolutely.
As you'd expect.
As you'd expect. However, it does so without, perhaps, fully grappling with the broader structural causes of the conflict. Specifically, Russia's long-standing, deeply ingrained fear of encirclement by potentially hostile powers.
Are these fears seen as legitimate or just paranoia?
Well, the analysis suggests they are not fabricated out of thin air. They are deeply rooted in Russia's history and its geography. Think about it. Napoleon's 1812 invasion, Hitler's 1941 Operation Barbarossa. Russia's vast but vulnerable landmass has repeatedly exposed it to existential threats.
Right, the lack of natural barriers.
Exactly. Even the 2023 mutiny by the Wagner Group, relatively recent, showed how rapidly instability can threaten the Russian heartland. These deeply embedded insecurities are part of Russia's strategic culture. They simply won't be resolved by sanctions or, rhetoric about regime change alone.
So, if the traditional approaches aren't working and the main players are seemingly inflexible, who can step in? This is where the analysis points towards India and China as potentially unique mediators.
They indeed emerge as arguably the most credible potential mediators in this current landscape.
Yeah.
And their credibility stems not from alignment with either side, but precisely from their strategic independence from the Western-led geopolitical blocs.
What gives them that unique position?
Several factors. Both are nuclear powers. Both wield significant global economic weight. Crucially, both have maintained open channels of communication with both Moscow and Kiev throughout the war.
Okay.
India in particular has navigated a really complex path here.
Tell us about India's position, the tightrope of non-alignment, as it's sometimes called.
Absolutely. Under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, India has meticulously walked that tightrope. It has carefully calibrated its votes in the UN, generally avoiding direct condemnation of Russia's actions.
While still helping Ukraine.
Yes, simultaneously providing significant humanitarian aid to Ukraine. You also have to remember India's historical legacy. As a leader of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War, it holds substantial moral capital, you could say, to mediate conflicts involving great power rivalry.
And their recent G20 presidency.
That was widely praised, yes. Praised for its ability to balance diverse interests and advocate effectively for the concerns of the global South. That builds credibility.
And China. Strategically closer to Russia, but perhaps with its own interest in stability.
That's correct. China, although it shares closer strategic ties with Russia, has consistently emphasized its interest in global stability. Remember its 12-point peace plan, released back in 2023.
Vaguely, yeah.
While it was admittedly vague on some key specifics, it did explicitly call for respect for sovereignty, a cessation of hostilities, and a commitment to negotiations.
Has China shown mediating capacity elsewhere?
It has, surprisingly effectively at times. Think about the quiet facilitation role it played in brokering the peace talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia in 2023. That was significant.
Interesting.
So together, India and China represent a powerful counterweight to the US-EU-NATO bloc. They are uniquely positioned, the argument goes, to offer Russia a face-saving off-ramp from the conflict.
While also influencing Ukraine.
Exactly. While simultaneously pushing Ukraine to seriously consider alternatives to full NATO integration. This really reflects the multipolar nature of today's world, doesn't it? Where peace perhaps cannot be dictated solely from Washington or Brussels anymore.
So let's explore this realistic political framework for peace that the sources propose. It sounds like it's trying to move beyond this zero-sum game we're stuck in. The first point is Ukraine reconsidering NATO membership.
Right, and the core question underpinning this framework is really, is peace truly possible without addressing the fundamental grievances and fears of all parties involved, not just one side?
Acknowledging everyone's perspective, even if you disagree.
Precisely. This framework attempts to do just that. The proposal suggests Ukraine should seriously explore adopting a neutral security posture, something akin to Austria's status after World War II.
What would that look like?
It would mean being militarily independent, essentially aligned with neither East nor West. The primary benefit here, it alleviates Russia's core security concern regarding perceived NATO encirclement.
And what would Ukraine get in return?
In return, Russia would need to formally recognize Ukraine's full sovereignty. And crucially, this would include the highly contested territory of Crimea, though that might need to be negotiated on a longer-term phased track.
And security guarantees, neutrality doesn't mean defenseless.
Absolutely not. This neutrality would also open pathways for alternative security guarantees, perhaps from the UN, or maybe a newly designed regional security architecture, something that offers Ukraine stability without the enormous cost of perpetual conflict over NATO.
Okay, that's the neutrality piece. Then there's the idea of UN-mediated military disengagement. That sounds like a crucial step for just building basic trust.
It would be essential, yes. The proposal outlines a phased and reciprocal withdrawal, both Russian and Ukrainian troops pulling back from the current front lines, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia.
How would that work in practice?
The process would need to be rigorously monitored by international observers, operating under a clear UN mandate. History does offer some precedents here.
Like what?
Well, We've seen similar mechanisms work, to varying degrees, with the UNIFIL peacekeeping force in Lebanon, which helped stabilize a very volatile border zone. Or think about the demilitarization zones established under the Dayton Accords in Bosnia that ultimately brought an end to a brutal conflict.
So it's possible, though difficult.
It's never easy, but these frameworks exist. They have a track record, warts and all.
Finally, the framework suggests a referendum and federalization for contested areas. Wow, that sounds like a huge political hurdle. Very sensitive.
It is incredibly sensitive, but it's a direct attempt to address the internal identity and political dynamics that have fueled the conflict for years, even before 2022.
So what's the specific proposal?
The proposal suggests that contested areas with significant Russian-speaking populations, estimated at maybe 17% of Ukraine's pre-war population, should be allowed to vote on their future status.
Under whose supervision?
Crucially, under international supervision to ensure legitimacy. But regardless of the outcome of such a vote, the framework suggests Ukraine agrees to adopt a federal model, similar to structures you see in, say, Switzerland or Canada.
To allow for autonomy.
Exactly. This structure would grant these regions substantial cultural and linguistic autonomy while, and this is key, unequivocally preserving Ukraine's overall territorial integrity.
Is there a precedent for that kind of internal arrangement after conflict?
The Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland is often cited. It managed to balance deeply rooted, conflicting unionist and nationalist demands within a shared legal and political framework. It's imperfect, but it stopped the violence.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. We often get stuck, don't we, in this idea that there is a definitively right side and a definitively wrong side in these conflicts. But what if the moral responsibility actually shifts? Shifts towards ending the suffering, even if that means making really complex, maybe unsatisfying compromises? That's a powerful shift in perspective. What does that mean for how we frame moral responsibility here?
That's a profound question, and it's absolutely central to the argument presented in these sources. Critics will inevitably, and perhaps understandably, argue that making concessions amounts to rewarding aggression. It feels wrong.
It does feel counterintuitive.
It does. However, history teaches us, again and again, that real, lasting peace is rarely, if ever, won through moral purity alone. Think about the 1973 Paris Peace Accords. They ended America's direct involvement in Vietnam, but they certainly didn't result in a clean, democratic victory or a morally unambiguous outcome.
Right.
Similarly, the 1993 Oslo Accords provided partial recognition between Israelis and Palestinians. Didn't resolve all their disputes, not by a long shot, but it was a start.
Imperfect diplomacy.
Imperfect, but foundational. In both cases, diplomacy, even with its flaws, laid essential groundwork for potential future progress, or at least stopped the immediate bloodshed. Moreover, the argument goes, continuing this devastating war under the banner of abstract principles while actively sacrificing millions of lives. Is that itself not a profound moral contradiction?
That's a heavy thought.
It is. The humanitarian cost, as we discussed earlier, Ukraine's GDP contracting over 40%, over 10 million displaced, hundreds of thousands dead or wounded. It's immense, and it's growing daily. So if peace genuinely requires compromise, then the moral responsibility in this specific context perhaps lies not in prolonging the fight indefinitely, but in actively working to end the suffering, even if the solution feels politically or morally complex.
Okay, let's shift gears now. Let's move from the battlefields to the equally contentious arena of global trade. Specifically, we need to dive into Donald Trump's tariff king claims against India and how India is strategically responding to that pressure.
Right. Trump's criticism of India's trade practices is a central component of his broader America First economic nationalism platform. It's consistent with his approach.
And he uses that phrase, tariff king, quite a bit regarding India.
He does. He often refers to India as the tariff king, due to what he perceives as exceptionally high import duties and trade barriers that, in his view, unfairly disadvantage American businesses trying to sell there.
And he took action on this.
Yes. In April 2025, using the authority of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEP, which is a powerful tool, allowing the U.S. president to regulate commerce during perceived emergencies, he proposed reciprocal tariffs. Basically, tit-for-tat tariffs on nations he believes practice unfair trade, and India was squarely in his sights.
So what are the specific points of contention? Where does he see the biggest imbalances that justify this tariff king label?
His focus is primarily on two main sectors where India is quite protectionist: agriculture and automobiles. According to the U.S. Trade Representative's data, India's average applied tariff on U.S. agricultural goods is a significant 37.7%. Now, contrast that with the U.S.'s much lower 5.3% average tariff on Indian agricultural imports. It's a big gap.
That is a big difference. And cars.
For automobiles, India imposes even higher tariffs, ranging anywhere from 60% to 100% on imported vehicles. This is explicitly designed to promote domestic production, the Make in India initiative, and protect its own growing auto industry. This disparity, particularly in these visible sectors, forms the core of Trump's argument.
To really understand the strategic interactions here, the sources suggest applying game theory. Now, that sounds like a pretty complex way to look at a trade dispute. Can you walk us through that framework? What does it reveal?
Yeah, it sounds academic, but it's actually a really useful way to think about it. Think of it like a high-stakes chess game, as you said earlier. Each player anticipates the other's moves, and the sources have basically mapped out the most likely scenarios and responses. We can analyze this using what's called a non-cooperative sequential game model. The players are the United States, under President Trump, and India.
In their objectives.
The U.S., in this model, aims to reduce its trade deficit, bolster domestic manufacturing, and interestingly, also realign global trade, maybe to discourage dealings with Russia.
Ah, so the geopolitics is tied in.
It's definitely tied in. India, on the other hand, seeks to maintain its export competitiveness, minimize any economic damage from tariffs, and crucially, preserve its strategic autonomy, especially regarding its long-standing defense and energy ties with Russia.
Okay, so what are the potential moves, the strategies for each player in this game?
All right, for the U.S., the strategies laid out include, first, imposing that baseline 25% tariff, which is reportedly slated for August 1st, 2025. That's move A1.
Got it.
Second, there's the threat of an additional 10% penalty, specifically linked to India's continued trade with Russia. That could raise the total tariff to 35%. Let's call that move A2.
More aggressive.
Much more aggressive. Third, the U.S. could try to negotiate a comprehensive trade deal, offering reduced tariffs in exchange for India opening its markets more, move A3. Or fourth, they could just maintain the status quo, maybe delaying tariffs to allow for more talks, move A4.
And India's options, what can they do in response? Let's call them B strategies.
Okay, India's potential strategies are B1, negotiate a deal trying to get those tariffs reduced or eliminated. B2, retaliate with their own tariffs on U.S. goods.
Risky.
Very risky. B3, diversify their exports, actively shifting trade away from the U.S. towards other markets like ASEAN, the EU, BRICS, maybe Africa. B4, strengthen their own domestic market, focusing inward on internal demand. Or B5, simply maintain the status quo and absorb the tariffs, taking the economic hit.
And how do we know which moves are better? What are the payoffs?
The payoffs for each combination of moves, like U.S. plays A1, India plays B3, are qualitatively modeled, basically ranked as high, medium, or low benefit for each country. This ranking depends on how the outcome affects their overall economy, their geopolitical standing, and even domestic political factors.
So where do things stand currently, economically speaking, between the U.S. and India before these potential tariffs hit? What's the baseline?
Right, the context is important. As of the 2024-25 fiscal year, India exported approximately $118 billion worth of goods and services to the U.S., and they ran a substantial trade surplus with the U.S. of around $45.7 billion.
So the U.S. buys more from India than India buys from the U.S.?
Correct. Key sectors in India that would be directly hit by these potential U.S. tariffs include chemicals, pharmaceuticals, textiles, and apparel. Those are big export earners for India.
Is there anything cushioning the blow for India?
Yes, a significant cushion comes from India's robust service exports, things like IT services, business process outsourcing. These were projected at a huge $387.5 billion in 2024-25, and they remain largely unaffected by tariffs on physical goods. That provides a lot of economic ballast.
And the Russia connection?
That's the geopolitical constraint. India's long-standing defense and energy ties with Russia are significant and cannot be easily or quickly reversed without major strategic implications for India's security and foreign policy. It complicates their choices.
Okay, now let's look at India's potential responses through this game theory lens. What does the model suggest happens if the U.S. imposes that initial 25% tariff, A1? What are India's best moves, B options?
If the U.S. implements the 25% tariff, A1, the analysis suggests India's most optimal moves are either B1, negotiate a deal, or B3, aggressively diversify its exports.
Why those two?
Well, negotiating B1 would involve trying to get those tariffs reduced, ideally below 20%. perhaps by offering limited concessions in other areas where they have some wiggle room. Diversifying exports, B3, means actively shifting focus to other key markets. India's trade with the ASEAN bloc, for example, is already substantial, around $123 billion, making it a viable pivot point, although building up trade elsewhere takes time.
What about the other options?
Strengthening domestic markets, B4, is seen as a good medium-term complementary strategy, but maybe not enough on its own in the short term. Retaliation, B2, or just absorbing the tariffs, D5, are considered high-risk, low-reward paths for India in this scenario. They likely lead to worse outcomes.
Okay, what if the U.S. goes for the more aggressive 35% tariff, A2, the one including the penalty for Russia trade? How do India's options change then?
If the U.S. imposes the higher 35% tariff, A2, India's options narrow considerably, according to the model. In this more confrontational scenario, B3, diversify exports, or B4, strengthen domestic markets, become the most viable strategies.
Why not negotiate them?
The sources indicate that negotiating under such intense pressure, especially with the explicit link to Russia ties, might compel India to compromise on core aspects of its sovereignty or strategic interest. That's a red line they'd be very reluctant to cross.
So they'd rather pivot away than concede on Russia.
Potentially, yes. Retaliation, B2, again risks a full-blown trade war, which India generally wants to avoid, and simply maintaining the status quo, B5, would inflict severe economic pain without any strategic benefit. So diversification and domestic strengthening look like the least bad options.
What if the U.S. offers a trade deal from the outset, A3, trying cooperation instead of confrontation?
If the U.S. leads by offering a comprehensive trade deal, A3, then negotiating, B1, becomes India's dominant and most clearly optimal response. Accepting a favorable deal, say, one that locks in reduced tariffs at maybe 10–15%, would be highly beneficial.
But there are conditions.
Yes, provided the deal aligns with India's established red lines, especially concerning its relationship with Russia and protecting its sensitive domestic sectors like agriculture and small retail. If the deal offered were weak or laden with unacceptable conditions, then diversification, B3, and strengthening domestic markets, B4, would still be secondary fallback options.
So when we cut through all the game theory moves and counter moves, what's the fundamental takeaway for India here? What does this modeling tell us about their actual leverage in this situation?
Yeah, the core insight, I think, is this. India isn't completely boxed in, even facing a potential trade conflict with the world's largest economy.
I have options.
They have distinct, viable paths to protect their interests. The game theory reveals that negotiation, if terms are right, or pivoting to new markets, diversification, are strong strategies. Understanding these potential moves and countermoves is really crucial for anyone watching how global trade dynamics are shifting.
Can we summarize or rank India's strategic options from most to least viable based on this analysis?
Sure, let's try to rank them based on the likely payoffs and feasibilities suggested by the sources. Number one, the primary strategy should probably be B1, negotiate a trade deal. Try to get those tariffs reduced significantly, maybe below 20%. This would involve being prepared to concede selectively, perhaps on things like dairy import quotas, or diversifying energy purchases away from Russia somewhat, but without crossing major red lines. India can leverage its $45.7 billion trade surplus, highlight its booming service sector, and position itself as a reliable democratic partner. Feasibility, moderate to high, if the U.S. terms are realistic.
Okay, plan A is negotiate. What's plan B?
Plan B, if negotiation doesn't yield a good outcome, is likely B3. Aggressively diversify exports, boost trade with existing partners like ASEAN, already 123B, the EU, other BRICS nations, actively pursue new free trade agreements. This option offers strategic autonomy and potential long-term gains, but it requires time and concerted effort. Feasibility, high, as India is already pursuing this, but the benefits aren't immediate.
And supporting strategies.
Number 3 would be B4, strengthen domestic markets. This is a strong complementary measure. Investing in domestic demand, manufacturing capabilities like the Make in India push, and boosting service exports further reduces external vulnerability. It aligns with India's long-term goals of self-reliance, feasibility, medium in the short term, high in the long term.
What about the less desirable options?
Right. Ranking lower, number 4 would be B2, retaliate with tariffs. This is seen as risky escalation. It could lead to a damaging trade war and potential WTO challenges, something India has historically tried to avoid. Feasibility, low. And last, number 5, B5, maintain status quo, absorb tariffs, just taking the hit. This would likely lead to an estimated 0.2% GDP loss, maybe more depending on the tariff level, without offering any strategic upside. Feasibility, very low, unlikely to be chosen unless absolutely forced.
So India has a clear preferred path, negotiate first, diversify second, but there are also crucial geopolitical factors and timing considerations here, aren't there? What are the key things they need to keep in mind as they navigate this?
That's right. It's not just economics. First, India has some flexibility, the analysis suggests, to reduce its exposure to Russian oil and weapons, maybe by diversifying purchases towards the UAE or Brazil for oil without needing to completely sever its strategic ties with Russia. It's a delicate balancing act.
And the deadline.
That August 1st deadline mentioned for Trump's proposed tariffs is critical. It forces India to decide relatively quickly, prioritize an immediate deal, even if imperfect, or commit fully to the diversification pivot. Time is a factor.
Is there any leverage in how Trump's tariffs compare to those on other countries?
Yes, that's an interesting point raised. Trump's average proposed tariff rates on India, while high, are actually noted as being lower than those he imposed or threatened on China, around 54%, or even Brazil, around 30%. Potentially gives India some bargaining room they aren't necessarily target number one.
And India's overall economic health.
That's the final piece. India's robust services-led growth, with GDP projected to increase around 6.5–7.5%, provides it with significantly more maneuverability compared to many other economies that are more heavily reliant on goods exports. It gives them an economic cushion and strengthens their negotiating position.
So, stepping back from the immediate U.S.-India dispute, what are the broader economic ripple effects of this whole protectionist trend we're seeing? It sounds like we're not just talking about dollars and cents or tariff percentages, but maybe also deep-seated cultural values and economic realities that aren't easily shifted by a simple tariff.
Precisely. And this takes us to the concerning issue of the fracturing global trade architecture.
Yeah.
We're seeing the rise of China, yes, but also what some sources call the economic awakening of the global south. Meaning countries across Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, South Asia. Collectively, they represent potentially a second China in terms of market size, labor power, and future consumer demand. There's huge potential there.
But the system isn't keeping up.
Exactly. The World Trade Organization, the WTO, which was designed precisely to harmonize rules and peacefully settle disputes in a multilateral way, it's been effectively, well, defanged.
How so?
This has been particularly pronounced since 2019, mainly due to the U.S.'s persistent refusal to approve new judges for the WTO's appellate body. That body is crucial. It's the Supreme Court of World Trade, essentially. Without it, the dispute resolution mechanism is basically powerless.
So what happens without a functioning WTO?
Global trade risks devolving into a series of messy bilateral power struggles. It becomes about who has the most clout, dominated by the strongest players. Trump's tariff policies are a prime symptom of this retreat from multilateralism. It shifts from negotiation to economic coercion.
And coercion isn't sustainable.
Coercion is not the language of a sustainable, interconnected world economy. It breeds resentment and instability.
And the basic economics of tariffs themselves, they're widely panned by economists across the board, aren't they? It feels like Econ 101 says they're generally a bad idea.
Universally, yes. Trump's broad-based tariffs feel like a throwback to a much earlier protectionist era, like the 1890 McKinley tariff. Mainstream economists, really across the ideological spectrum, from Paul Krugman on the left to Greg Mankiw on the right, consistently pan them as unsustainable tools for achieving long-term prosperity.
Why? What's the core economic argument against them?
Economically, tariffs essentially function as sales taxes. They're paid initially by the importers bringing goods into the country, but those costs are then almost always passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices.
So consumers ultimately pay.
Overwhelmingly. Studies consistently show that a substantial chunk, somewhere between 70% and 90% of tariff costs, are ultimately absorbed by U.S. consumers. This drives inflation, and it disproportionately hurts lower and middle-income Americans because they spend a larger share of their income on basic goods, which are often imported.
So it hits the poorest hardest.
It does. And when you combine that effect with simultaneous political pushes for, say, tax breaks for the very wealthy or corporations, the net result, according to some analyses, amounts to a massive upward wealth transfer.
Some call it class warfare disguised as patriotism.
That's a phrase used in some of the source material, yes. And recent polls, for what they're worth, showing Trump's approval rating perhaps dipping into the low 30s, often cite these kitchen table economic concerns. Inflation, cost of living is a major factor. People feel it.
So the impact isn't always immediate, but these tariffs definitely hit home eventually, causing this delayed inflation.
That's the phenomenon, yes. If, hypothetically, a 10% tariff is imposed on, say, $500 billion worth of imports, simple math suggests it could raise overall consumer prices by $35–45 billion annually. Now, consumers might initially react by delaying purchases, maybe cutting back, which can push the full inflationary effects further down the line.
But it catches up.
It tends to catch up. If these tariffs persist over time, inflation could indeed accelerate. For instance, a scenario sketched out suggests tariffs imposed in late 2025 might not cause an immediate inflation spike, but could start to push it upwards noticeably in 2026, maybe pushing the Consumer Price Index, CPI, back above 3%.
And what does the Fed do then?
Well, that would likely trigger the Federal Reserve to tighten monetary policy again, meaning raising interest rates to cool inflation. But raising rates also slows economic growth. The scenario suggests growth could cool to maybe 1.5% by 2027, which isn't disastrous, but it's sluggish. Again, higher interest rates combined with inflation tend to widen the wealth gap as lower-income groups struggle more with rising costs and borrowing becomes more expensive.
You know, it feels like there's often a bit of a double standard at play here. The U.S. frequently accuses other countries, like India, of protectionism. But doesn't the U.S. engage in its own protectionist practices? Is that a fair assessment?
That's a very fair point, and it's highlighted in the analysis as well. While the U.S. champions free trade rhetoric, it certainly shields its own domestic industries through substantial subsidies and targeted tariffs in key areas.
Like agriculture.
Agriculture is a prime example. The U.S. Department of Agriculture spends somewhere between $15 billion and $20 billion annually on various farm subsidies, direct payments, crop insurance, disaster aid, primarily for big commodity crops like corn, soy, dairy, and cotton.
And how does that affect global trade?
These subsidies distort global trade significantly. They allow U.S. producers to export goods at prices that farmers in many developing nations who lack similar government support simply cannot compete with. An IMF study from 2024 actually found that U.S. farm subsidies ironically contributed to about $27 billion in lost U.S. farm exports between 2018 and 2019, mainly due to retaliatory tariffs imposed by countries like China who were protesting those very subsidies.
So it can backfire. Are there other sectors besides agriculture where the U.S. uses protectionism?
Oh, absolutely. The U.S. levies a long-standing 25% tariff on imported light trucks, famously known as the chicken tax, dating back to the 1960s. There's also a 2.5% tariff on passenger cars, which offers some protection to domestic brands.
And more recently?
More recently, Trump's 2018 steel and aluminum tariffs, 25% on steel, 10% on aluminum, were highly controversial. While intended to help those specific industries, they raised costs significantly for other U.S. manufacturers who use steel and aluminum, and studies suggest they led to a net decrease in output and employment in those downstream industries.
What about electric vehicles? That's a hot topic.
Yes, very current. Under both the Biden and Trump administrations, the U.S. has imposed a staggering 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. This effectively keeps major Chinese EV companies like BYD, which, by the way, now surpasses GM in global EV sales, completely out of the U.S. market.
Why such a high tariff?
The justifications are framed around national security concerns, unfair subsidies in China, and protecting nascent U.S. EV manufacturing. But the effect is pure protectionism. Interestingly, it mirrors India's own cautious, often restrictive approach towards Chinese investments and imports in sensitive sectors.
So the bottom line is?
The bottom line is that both India and the U.S. use national interest arguments to justify their respective protectionist measures when it suits them. Neither can really claim the moral high ground when it comes to open markets versus protectionism. There's hypocrisy on multiple sides.
This also brings up that really interesting point you touched on earlier about cultural sensitivity in trade negotiations, particularly when it comes to agriculture between the U.S. and India.
Yes, it's a critical and often completely overlooked dimension of these talks. Trump, for example, has reportedly demanded repeatedly that India open its agricultural markets further, and at times has specifically included beef in those demands.
Which is a non-starter in India.
It's an absolute non-starter. Demanding market access for beef completely lacks cultural sensitivity regarding India. Cows are revered by the majority Hindu population. It's deeply ingrained culturally and religiously. Any serious effort to include beef in trade talks is, frankly, doomed to fail from the outset. It shows a lack of basic homework.
So what do U.S. negotiators focus on instead?
Well, recognizing the impossibility of beef, U.S. negotiators have had to pivot. They now focus on demanding better access for things like dairy products, poultry, and pulses, like lentils.
How does India react to those demands?
India has still staunchly resisted opening up sensitive sectors, especially its massive $100 billion dairy sector. This isn't just about economics, it's about livelihoods. That sector supports over 80 million rural households, most of them very small-scale farmers. Allowing large-scale U.S. dairy imports could devastate those livelihoods.
So it's politically explosive.
Highly politically explosive. It highlights how complex trade negotiations become when they intersect with these deeply held cultural values and critical domestic economic realities that simply cannot be ignored or wished away by negotiators.
It's clear that these trade tensions and the Ukraine conflict are not isolated incidents. They seem to be part of a larger global shift, a reordering, perhaps. And to understand how powers like India and China might cooperate in shaping this new global order, the sources suggest they first need to, quote, bury the hatchet over their own historical border dispute. That sounds like a monumental task, given their past.
It is a profound challenge, absolutely. And it raises that core question again. How can two nations with such fundamentally different interpretations of a shared, often painful past realistically find common ground to build a multipolar future?
Their ability to reconcile seems key.
Their ability to manage, if not fully reconcile, these narratives could be critical for broader global stability. Understanding their historical conflict, particularly the 1962 war, is absolutely key if we're going to assess their potential roles today, both as mediators in conflicts like Ukraine and as significant economic partners in potentially building a new trade order, one that might counterbalance the kind of U.S. economic coercion we've been discussing.
Okay, so let's delve into that history. We need to look at the two distinct perspectives of the 1962 India-China War, as presented in the sources. Let's start with the Chinese perspective. They frame the conflict as a defensive counterattack. What does that mean?
Right. From China's official viewpoint and the narrative often presented, the war was a necessary defensive response to Indian actions. They maintained that territories like Aksai Chin in the west and parts of what India calls Arunachal Pradesh, then known as the Northeast Frontier Agency, or NIFA, in the east, have historically been Chinese territory.
Aksai Chin was strategically important.
Extremely. Aksai Chin, a high-altitude desert plateau, was considered crucial by China for linking its restive regions of Tibet and Xinjiang. China completed building the G219 highway through Aksai Chin in the 1950s to solidify this link. India protested this construction vigorously, viewing it as encroachment on its territory. China, however, viewed the road as vital for national integration and internal security within its claimed borders.
And what about India's actions leading up to the war?
Chinese narratives assert that India, under Prime Minister Nehru, adopted an aggressive forward policy in the years leading up to 1962. This policy involved establishing small military outposts, sometimes beyond India's own claimed boundary lines, pushing into territory China considered its own. From Beijing's perspective, these actions were seen as deliberately provocative and expansionist. Mao Zedong and other Chinese leaders reportedly viewed Nehru's India as having ambitions to challenge China's position in Asia.
And the whole issue with Tibet and the Dalai Lama played a significant role too, right? That must have severely complicated relations.
Yes, hugely significant. The 1959 Tibetan uprising against Chinese rule and the subsequent flight of the Dalai Lama and thousands of refugees to India severely strained relations. From China's perspective, India granting asylum to the Dalai Lama was seen as a direct interference in its internal affairs and a blatant challenge to Chinese sovereignty over Tibet, which they had asserted militarily in 1950-51.
Did China trust India's intentions?
The sources suggest not entirely. They believe Prime Minister Nehru harbored hegemonic aspirations in Asia, perhaps seeing India as the natural leader of the newly independent, non-aligned world. They viewed the Panchsheel policy, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence agreed upon by India and China in 1954, emphasizing non-interference and mutual respect as potentially just rhetoric from India, masking underlying territorial ambitions.
So for China, the war itself was a calculated, limited action, not an attempt to conquer territory.
Precisely. That's the official narrative. China claims it launched a limited military operation primarily to teach India a lesson, push back the Indian outposts, and decisively reassert the line of actual control, or LAC, as China perceived it. They viewed the war as strategically decisive but militarily restrained. Chinese forces advanced quickly, inflicted heavy losses on the unprepared Indian army, but then crucially declared a unilateral ceasefire and voluntarily withdrew, largely back to their pre-war positions, especially in the eastern sector.
Why withdraw if they won?
This withdrawal was intended, from China's perspective, to signal that they had no long-term territorial ambitions to occupy large parts of Arunachal Pradesh. The unilateral ceasefire and withdrawal were presented by Chinese officials then, and historically since, as evidence of their peaceful intent and as a necessary corrective action forced upon them by India's perceived aggression and refusal to negotiate the border reasonably.
How is the war remembered in China today?
Interestingly, the war is rarely emphasized in mainstream Chinese public media or school textbooks compared to, say, conflicts with Japan or the West. But when it is referenced, it's consistently portrayed as a justified, legitimate defensive response to Indian provocation. And importantly, China still firmly opposes India's sovereignty claims over Arunachal Pradesh, routinely referring to it as South Tibet. So the question lingers. How do these deep-seated historical grievances and conflicting border claims still impact their ability to cooperate today, especially when the world might need them to act as responsible global power brokers?
The Indian perspective, as you can probably guess, is dramatically different. India sees itself as the victim of outright, unprovoked aggression.
That's a key distinction, yes. The India narrative views the 1962 war fundamentally as an act of unprovoked aggression by a larger, more powerful neighbor. An act that betrayed a stated policy of peaceful coexistence and violated established international norms regarding borders.
What was India's basis for its border claims?
India maintains that it inherited legitimate colonial-era boundaries upon independence in 1947. This included the McMahon Line in the eastern sector, which was negotiated between British India and Tibet back in 1914, and, in India's view, clearly defined the border there. In the western sector, India considers Aksai Chin an integral part of its Ladakh region, based on historical treaties and administrative control, arguing that China had no valid historical claim over Aksai Chin until after it militarily occupied Tibet in the 1950s.
And the spirit of friendship at the time, that Hindi Chini Bai Hai slogan, Indians and Chinese are brothers, that must have made the conflict feel like a betrayal.
Absolutely. That sense of betrayal is central to the Indian narrative. India had actually been a strong supporter of the People's Republic of China on the world stage, advocating for its entry into the UN and formally recognizing Chinese sovereignty over Tibet, albeit hoping for Tibetan autonomy. The Panchsheel Agreement of 1954 was genuinely seen in India as a high point of post-colonial Asian solidarity and friendship. So the war in 1962 was widely perceived as a profound, almost personal betrayal of that spirit by China.
What about China building that road through Aksai Chin? How did India see that?
India's discovery of that road in the late 1950s, which China had built across territory India claimed, was viewed as a stealthy, covert invasion, an aggressive act carried out without any diplomatic notification or consultation. It significantly hardened attitudes in New Delhi.
And India's own forward policy, China called it aggressive, but India saw it differently.
That's correct. From the Indian perspective, its forward policy was designed solely to reassert administrative control over territory it firmly believed was its own, based on its interpretation of the borders. It was intended to prevent further Chinese encroachment, not to provoke a war. The military outposts India established were, from its viewpoint, within its legitimate, albeit disputed, boundaries.
So the attack came as a surprise.
India portrays the Chinese offensive on October 20, 1962, as a well-coordinated surprise attack launched simultaneously on Indian positions in both the western Ladakh and eastern Nifa sectors. India believes this attack was premeditated and planned by China, not merely a reaction to local skirmishes or the forward policy. The Indian Army at the time was poorly equipped for high-altitude warfare, lacked proper infrastructure, and was politically unprepared for a full-scale conflict, leading to a swift and humiliating defeat, especially in the eastern sector where Chinese forces advanced deep into Arunachal Pradesh before their withdrawal.
And how did India interpret China's unilateral withdrawal? Not as gesture of peace, presumably.
Precisely the opposite. China's withdrawal is generally seen in India as a purely tactical and strategic move, not a generous one. It's viewed as a maneuver made only after China had achieved its military objectives, humiliating India, demonstrating its regional dominance, and forcibly establishing its version of the line of actual control on the ground, particularly in Aksai Chin. India believes China's goal was to redraw the LAC unilaterally through force.
What was the impact of the war within India?
The war was a national trauma. It shattered India's self-image as a leader of the non-aligned world and exposed its military unpreparedness. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru's leadership came under heavy criticism for misjudging China's intentions and for neglecting the army's modernization. The defeat led directly to massive defense reforms in India and instilled a deep, long-lasting suspicion of China's motives that persist to this day.
And the border dispute itself.
It remains unresolved. India continues to claim Aksai Chin as its territory, illegally occupied by China. China continues to claim virtually all of Arunachal Pradesh as South Tibet. The line of actual control remains disputed and undefined in several areas, leading to periodic tensions and military standoffs, most notably the deadly clashes in the Galwan Valley in 2020. Given these deeply ingrained, fundamentally conflicting narratives and the unresolved territorial dispute, what do you think is the biggest obstacle they need to overcome to truly bury the hatchet and effectively play that pivotal global mediation role we discussed earlier? It seems like a huge gap to bridge.
That's a profound thought to end that section on. We've synthesized a lot today, haven't we? Bringing together these threads of geopolitical conflict in Ukraine, the escalating economic tensions, particularly between the US and India, and the shifting global power dynamics. What really stands out to me listening back is this consistent message emerging from the analyses. The world desperately needs bold political thinking and genuine cooperation, not just more military pressure or economic coercion tactics.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, I think this deep dive really shows us that these huge global challenges aren't just about policy papers or power plays. Fundamentally, they seem to be about trust, or the lack of it, and perhaps a necessary reevaluation of our core values. It feels like a call for a much more holistic approach to achieving peace and prosperity.
The sources definitely advocate for new paradigms, don't they?
They do, strongly. This includes the urgent need for reforming or creating new multilateral trade institutions, ones that genuinely include and reflect the voices and interests of the global South, not just the established powers. It also highlights the imperative for India itself to pursue its next wave of internal reforms, things like digitization, decarbonization, deregulation, to truly solidify its position as a resilient global economic player.
And for resolving conflicts.
Crucially, the emphasis is that peace must ultimately be achieved through diplomacy, through difficult political compromises, not through endless, costly proxy wars. And for the U.S. specifically, there's a clear call within some of the analyses for its own internal institutional reforms, particularly to address its growing internal inequalities and ensure greater democratic legitimacy and consistency in its foreign policy.
And underlying all of this, there seems to be a deeper, almost philosophical crisis being hinted at in some of the sources. It feels like they're pointing to something beyond just the usual economics and politics.
Indeed. Several sources point towards what they term a spiritual crisis of capitalism. The argument is that trade, and international relations more broadly, should ideally be built on a foundation of trust. But this trust has been severely corroded.
By what?
By inconsistent behavior. Particularly cited is U.S. behavior, for example, arming certain authoritarian regimes while simultaneously condemning others for human rights abuses, or, historically, the U.S.'s reluctance, decades ago, to fully engage India as a strategic defense partner, which ironically pushed India towards greater reliance on Russian arms, a factor still playing out today.
So it's about hypocrisy eroding trust.
Partly, yes. But it goes deeper than just policy inconsistency. Some sources suggest there's a deeper crisis where money, greed, and deception have become overly dominant forces in global affairs. Ancient Hindu cosmology, for instance, refers to this kind of era as the Kali Yuga, an age characterized by moral decline and materialism.
Are there parallels in other traditions?
Absolutely. The Bible, too, contains numerous warnings about the corrupting influence of wealth and the pursuit of money. Above all else, it mentions money, more often than almost any other concept. The underlying suggestion across these different frameworks is that without a stronger foundation of trust, shared values, and ethical considerations, our complex economic and political systems are inherently fragile and prone to conflict.
So it's really a call for a fundamental shift in perspective, almost a kind of redemption.
You could frame it that way. There's a sense in some of the analyses of a growing chorus calling for a new economic and spiritual awakening, a potential movement away from purely extractive, profit-driven capitalism towards something more equitable, more sustainable, maybe more human.
What forms might that take?
Some sources use evocative metaphors. One mentions Kalkiism, drawing on the Hindu concept of Kalki, the final avatar of Vishnu who is prophesied to arrive at the end of the Kali Yuga to destroy evil and usher in a new, just age, the Satya Yuga. Others, drawing from Abrahamic traditions, might see parallels in the yearning for the return of the Messiah, or the Mahdi.
Powerful metaphors.
They are powerful metaphors, yes. They signal, perhaps, a shared, deep-seated human longing for redemption, for a fundamental reevaluation of our global values and the systems we've built, a desire to move beyond cynicism and conflict.
So, reflecting on all of this, what stands out to you, the listener, from today's deep dive? How do you think we collectively can shift from this prevailing mindset of conflict and coercion towards one built more on mutual recognition and shared growth? We've certainly given you a lot to think about today, and we really encourage you to keep exploring these complex ideas.
Because, as one of our sources provocatively concludes, and it's worth mulling over, trade isn't war, tariffs aren't strategy, and growth without justice is just inequality with the PR team.
That's a powerful final thought. The world deserves better, and perhaps it's up to all of us, global leaders and citizens alike, to start building that better future together.